Hello, welcome to Shaman Sister Sessions, episode 97. And I'm Katherine Bird. I'm here with Michelle Hawk. And we are going to talk today about rewilding and returning to our more primal nature and some of our essence of who we are. And so this is an interesting topic. I'm super excited to chat with Michelle about rewilding. She has some new rewilding offerings that she's doing and kind of reclaiming that physical essence and connecting to what it means to be wild. But this is also a movement that's been happening. You might have been paying attention to it here and there and seen little pieces and things like this, but this is coming up a lot. So it's a good conversation to be having. Especially when in context of mystical works or spiritual works or shamanism or being a healer, being a practitioner of what does it actually mean to be more in tune with a wild sense of self or connection to nature, connection to who we are in a more primal essence. So, yay! How you doing, Michelle?
Yay. I'm great. And yeah, as Kat was mentioning, this is something that I'm starting to, not that I'm starting to do because I've been doing it for a very long time myself, but I'm starting to actually tell people about it and invite people to come do it with me. So that's where some new growth and direction is happening in the expression of my work. But again, this rewilding phenomenon is becoming more and more popular. There's different retreats and different teachings and whatever that people are doing now, but essentially looking at and a lot of this is kind of a continuation of our last episode on embodiment. In case you missed it, I recommend circling back around, either if you want to pause this now and go listen to that one or just circle back later. But looking at how are we not wild, or how have we become not wild, or how have we become tamed by social conditioning or by being separate from our bodies, or a whole host of factors which essentially remove us from that original nature of self that is a wild animal. We live in bodies that first, before they are anything else, that it's an animal body, and we call ourselves human, and yet every other non-human being on earth is an animal. And so how silly is it that we remove ourselves from it when with just as any other animal, we have this experience of being on earth and this more feral, primal aspect of ourselves. And so the question in rewilding is looking at, okay, what is in the way? Like, what's layered on top of that is preventing us from accessing the full power and potential that lives in the self as a wild being.
Cool.
Yeah. Right. And it's a lot of fun, first and foremost. I think this is something that, and again, I've been in varying degrees of this practice for a long time, and for just knowing that that's something that I enjoy for myself, and years dancing and practicing shape-shifting. And Kat and I, the very first project that we did together, I think we've told you about on this podcast before, but the very first work that Kat and I produced together was called Animal Dance. And it was a shamanic embodiment workshop where we led people through a journey to meet their animal guide, and then led people through an experience of embodying and shape-shifting into their animal guide, which was essentially a process or part of a facet of rewilding, of how are we in our own body having this experience of our own wild nature and translating that into this lived experience.
Mm-hmm. And we can see this in different places, like even all of the, what do you call it? And it's not just the keto, but there's the what's the diet, right? Where people are trying to sort of figure out what we would have eaten in the past and release some of the things that are more modern, our processed foods and sugars and things that we've sort of layered on our diet, which haven't been healthy. And we've layered on a lot of things. And like Michelle said, all of our social structures around not letting ourselves be in connection with nature and not letting ourselves be a part of nature. And maybe you grew up in a place where there wasn't even a lot of nature, or nature was very controlled, right? If you look at, I know I grew up in a lot of suburban neighborhoods, and nature was very controlled. There was very specific. This is the lawn and the tree, and we cut the tree to look like a little bush. And, it was very controlled nature. There wasn't a lot of wild space. I was lucky as a child that there was some wild space that I was always like seeking out and trying to find, and running around in the wild spaces as much as possible. But for a lot of us, if you think back to what your childhood was like, or just where you've been since you've been an adult, and maybe you've been living in the city since maybe your whole life you've lived in the city and haven't even spent that much time in actual real nature. And the awareness around the difference that there is when you're in tune with more of nature, natural cycles, and all of that. And you don't necessarily have to go and be like me and be like, oh, I'm going to go live on several acres in kind of the middle of nowhere here and look at the mountains and the birds and things. You don't necessarily have to do that in order to incorporate some practices and some awareness and some intention that are going to support what it means to feel a little more wild. And I think when we say wild, like you think it's like wild and free. It's like, well, why wouldn't we want to be more wild and free and less contained and constricted and held in sort of that same system that the trees were held in suburbia, right? We've become that tree. So our encouragement today is to start to look at your life, and maybe from your past and your present, and how have you shut off some of your wildness, and what would it be like if you just added just a little bit more wild and free into your experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let's. I love this direction we're going, and let's kind of look at the connotation around wild. So, because there can be this sort of, I see people do this, and this was part of my experience too when I started getting into this years ago, was looking at this almost overcorrection from being this, or from living in this sort of curated, manicured, conditioned state, this tamed state, into overcorrecting to, like really like big and loud and lots of emoting and being in this more connected primal state. And yet, nature, let's look at, what does wild actually mean, and what does wild actually look like? We find when we're in connection, it simply means that original state, like the pure state. And there's a lot of connection to innocence, right? Like the animals are completely guileless. There's this innocence consciousness, and it's also around connected and at liberty, right? So Kat's saying wild and free doesn't necessarily mean, when we are rewilded, doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to go crazy and, quit your job and, wear a loincloth, right? That's not necessarily what wild means in this context, because most of us are still choosing to live in the world. Most of us are still, interfacing with other people and going grocery shopping and having this more cultural norm experience, but we're doing it from this place of our own innocence, from our own original nature and that pure essence that is connected to Gaia, that is connected to the pulse of life and the flow of life. So when we're talking about rewilding, again, a lot of people think, or, I talk about this with people and they think like, okay, we're going to go, roll around in mud in the forest and like be naked, wild women together. Maybe that might be part of the experience, but that in itself does not constitute what does it mean to live in a wild life, an embodied wild life. And I really think that part of the rewilding movement, this is again a continuation of our last episode when we talked about embodiment, is around accessing the codes and the blueprints and the energetic structure of Gaia through our own bodies. And that, I think, is part of the core of the rewilding process and the rewilding movement, is how do we open up access to the power and the wisdom of Earth through the portal of our own wild nature that lives in our bodies. And by turning up the volume on that and turning down the volume on social conditioning, there's so much power that is available to us there. That's what then we live in our lived experience. And that's what we're bringing to, engaging with other people and having this almost like bringing it to the human level, I'll say, going from translating the power of the animal nature into the human experience. And that's where I see this really healthy intersection of connecting with the wild self, but still being able to live in the world.
Yeah, that seems really important.
Yeah. Right. Because, we're not living in, most of us are not choosing to live alone in the woods by ourselves, right? How do you experience this, Kat? How's that show up for you?
Well, I think that for me, and that integrated piece around being in nature, for me, feels like a lot of it has to do with just being in contact with that energy and being in contact with, I do choose to live on a property where there is a lot more silence and a lot more animals that I'm seeing every day. And I have always been very connected to plants and the plant world, and growing plants and figuring out what the native plants are in an area and choosing to support those and support animals by having certain plants that are going to support them that they might not have access to, but that should be there. And being connected to, you can even see, I think from here, like my animals and all of my little creatures that I have that I keep around me. Like I'm very drawn to the natural world and to the animal world, and I always have been. And to what does it mean to be connected and be in reverence to nature and be in like a very strong stream of honor and gratitude to nature, and to be feeling not above nature, but in collaboration to nature. And what is because everybody's going to be different. Your collaborative experience of being with nature in collaboration might look like learning how to skin an animal and make a drum or make an outfit, or like learning how to trap, or to like be in nature for extended periods of time and take care of yourself completely. And that might be this very wild, true collaborative experience for you. And that might be just completely out of context for who you are as a human being right now. And it might not fit with where you're at. And that might seem like way overkill and overload. But it might be being more in tune with the area that you live in, and tuning into the climate and the natural plants that should be living there, and choosing to compost and choosing to, in that way, give back to the land and be in touch with the land and be in touch with what it means to just be paying attention to nature, to be paying attention to the seasons, to be paying attention to the moon and the stars and the sun and the way that the weather patterns are in your area. And paying greater attention to nature, to me, is part of the way that I collaborate with nature and feel that connection. And some people could look at that and be like, well, that's not wild, right? That's not running around in the forest with no clothes on. Like, I'm totally up for that too. But on a day-to-day practical experience, it's a little bit more for me on tuning into the plants that I have and supporting them and nurturing them, and having a lot of stones and minerals and animals around me all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an important distinction to look at. Well, how does embodying your wild express for you, right? And knowing that we have this spectrum of experience where there might be times when, obviously right now we're interfacing with technology, right? We're on the computer recording a podcast episode, and we're in an indoor environment with artificial lighting, right? And yet, we're still bringing some level of wildness to the experience by being in our bodies, by taking care of our animal needs, by accessing that embodied wisdom that comes from connection, that comes from this liberated experience. And there might be other times, for example, where, at this other end of the spectrum, where, I like to go off by myself in nature and have these really, these very non-cognitive, non-human experiences where I am, respectful of nature. It's not like I'm tromping through a protected area in the undergrowth, right? But I'm consciously participating with listening and engaging with the birds and the animals, and being present in this other state of being, this more wild state of being. And I don't have, either my phone's off or it's silent, or it has no bearing on my experience, and I might be hours just in this other way of interfacing and engaging with my own body and with the world, or do overnight trips, camping, etc. And it's not necessarily, and I see some of this, part of the reason why I'm wanting to emphasize the integration of this so much is because, again, I see this overcorrection where people, and then they go back to their regular lives, right? Where people are, they're feeling stuck, or they're feeling trapped or oppressed, or, like they don't fit in their lives, or they need to be a certain, put on a certain face in order to be the parent and the coworker and the professional and the nurturer, all these things. They need to be that. And it's like this layers of conditioning and layers of crap over their own original nature, and they just want to rip it off and totally go screaming into the forest. But then they come back to their lives and they put all the layers back on. So part of, again, the rewilding is not only having this experience of what is it like to embody your own wild nature and live as this, and have an experience as this wild animal self, but how then do we translate our wildness into a way that we can sustain, and a way that we can have in the world, and have as our lived experience, that is going to not only impact our own experience, but impact the way that we're relating to humanity as a society. Because I think it's fair to say there are a lot of these agreed upon structures, a whole lot of these, very conditioned, very curated experiences and systems that we have in place that are designed specifically to keep us from our wildness, that are designed to make us feel powerless, that are designed to source our sense of validation from an external source, that are designed to help us not be in our bodies. And thinking about school and thinking about government and all these systems that are in place to keep us from our wildness. So I see this again, not only as, well, what becomes available to us on the personal level in terms of power and confidence and strength and freedom, but then how, by us living in our wildness, do we then tip the scales and change the nature of how we're living as a collective of humans on Earth.
Mm-hmm. Because when we're really in touch with that, then we make decisions based on that. We make decisions of who we're supporting as our leaders or what we're buying or so on, based on more of a connected sense of being a part of the world, as in the earth, being more of a part of the earth. And so that's only going to be a benefit to whatever way that you relate to this, or that you're inspired by this, or that you want to engage with what this means to you. Then it's only going to awaken in you more of a feeling of connection and more of a feeling of being a part of this larger experience of what the earth is, and really more compassion and more responsibility, I think, as well. Like, the more connected that we are, the more, it's funny because it's like, oh, the more wild we are, it's like the more responsible we are. It doesn't quite make sense, because we think that it would be like, oh, if we were wild, we would just let all of our responsibilities go and we would just like be wild. But truthfully, the more that we're engaged in this deep sense of personal connection, then we are actually becoming more responsible, because we're feeling into all of our actions at a deeper level, because this process of being more connected, it is being more embodied. And in that, we're becoming more conscious of everything that we're doing. It's hard to just sort of live one life and then live another. And when we start to have an experience of being what would be considered rewild, then it's only natural that you start to actually have more of a sense of overall connection to the natural world, and your place in it and your responsibility for taking care of it, and to take actions based on that. And I think that that's really important. And then that's why that we've been trained out of it, that schools and so on are so institutional and so disconnected from nature and so disconnected from the earth. Because if people are really, really concerned about the earth, then they're not as concerned about climbing the corporate ladder and engaging in business that is going to be harmful instead of helpful.
Yeah. The more investment we have in our bodies and in the earth and in healthy collaborative power, like true authentic power and life force, then these other structures that are designed to profit and make money, then they simply won't continue. And
right.
so
then you don't need it. You don't need that. You don't need that form of power, because you understand more your own intrinsic power and your own intrinsic nature. So you're not searching outside of yourself for status and money and, all of these things to be the most important thing in the world, because you have a greater sense of self. And whenever you have a greater sense of self, then you have more self-confidence and more ability to flow with life and to handle things that are coming up and to make decisions based on your values, your ethics, on what you want the world to feel like, instead of trying to sort of get something, right? When we have a deep connection to, oh, I am a part of this larger scheme of experience and this greater energy, and I have that in my body, and I am that, and I am really connected to that source of life, then all of our decisions start to come from a different place, a more sourced place, a more empowered place. And then we start to see ourselves more in collaboration and service, and being able to be really grateful for what we have. So it's a great shifter, and which is why our society doesn't necessarily desire that. And yet humans have wanted it for, there's lots of stories of people who are like, yeah, I just can't take this grind, and I need to find a simpler way.
And there's an aspect of, and I actually had a client ask me maybe last week or so, is it possible to have this wild experience? Like, is it possible to embody our own wild nature, to rewild ourselves and to still interface with other people, right? And, here's where we look at, again, the animal nature. So the biologist in me loves to look at this. And I invite you to be looking at, well, animal behavior wise, humans completely removing social conditioning, we are social animals. We've evolved societies, we've evolved and grown these structures of societies. It's not the connection, the social connection itself that is harmful. It's all the bullshit institution that is actually harmful. And there are plenty of animals, in fact, many, many animals in the world are social animals, and they have their own social dynamics. They have their wild way of relating to each other that is perfectly healthy and perfectly cultivating a sense of not only self, but connection to something beyond the self. So a favorite example that I have is looking at horses, because for a variety of reasons. Number one, they're non-predatory animals. So looking at a prey animal, and how does a non-predatory social animal relate to each other in a healthy collaborative way. And seeing that, horses, and I do a lot of work with horses, so I get to see firsthand these wild Mustangs who are now living in, they were rounded up out of the wild because the BLM rounds up wild horses every year, and they were rescued from being sent to execution. And now they have their own herd structure at this ranch where I work at. They have their own herd structure that is in a context of working and interfacing with humans, but they're still wild animals. And they have social checks, they have relationships, they have communication. If one of them's being an asshole, he's going to get bitten, right? And there's the baby who was born in captivity, and so she's learning social cues and a healthy way of engaging with her aunties. All her aunties are teaching her how to be a horse, how to be a wild animal. And she's also learning how to engage with humans and how to have a healthy human experience. So humans as wild animals, we evolved as social beings. We do have this necessity to, for our mental and emotional and physical health and well-being, it is vitally important that we continue to interface with other humans. And it is possible to do so in a way that also honors our wildness, that honors our original nature. We have so many examples of non-human animals doing this in a healthy way that provide healthy social checks and accountability that take into account not only the needs of the individual, but also the needs of the group, that are harmonious and healthy and constructive and collaborative, that have the pieces in place to train humans how to be humans in this wild structure. So it's entirely possible. It is absolutely a thing. And rewilding the self, again, Kat was talking a lot about the connection to plants and animals and to nature, and it can also help us be more connected in a more authentic way to other humans when we're from this place, relating from this wild place.
Mm-hmm. And so just what's been imposed. So I think, and earlier I talked about doing some writing about your childhood, and I think in the last episode I talked a lot about like embodiment and what that mean to you as a child, but also, what is it meant to you as you've been a child or grown or as an adult? Like, what are the stories that you have about the wild, or what that means, or what do you feel is standing in the way, or what do you feel would you have to give up if you were going to step into being more wild? And I know that I came from a family, my mom was like really anti-camping. She thought that sounded like the worst idea in the world. So I learned how to camp by myself. I taught myself how to camp Probably like in my late 20s and in my 30s, I I learned how to do it myself, and it really wasn't that easy. Not having someone teach me what was what. And every time I went, I had learned something new. But I was carrying an enormous amount of fear of the wild, based on media and based on like being exposed to a lot of movies and things where, especially as a child, where the teenagers, when they go to the forest, they all get slaughtered and killed, right? Like that's the thing. If you go into the ocean, the shark's going to eat you. If you go into the mountains, the bear is going to attack you. If you go, like, nature has been demonized and wildness has been demonized in our culture through media. And so, or either some crazy person or some animal is going to murder you and kill you and eat you or whatever. Like, something bad is going to happen if you engage with the wild, if you engage with that. Or maybe you're going to lose your mind and you're going to become the guy who, like, completely goes off his rocker and walks off into the forest, never to be seen again, right? So there's all of these like media representations that show us that this is a dangerous path. Don't go that direction. Stay in the safe zone over here. So that's an encouragement just to kind of look at, like, what have you been taught about nature and wildness? And we also can look at our own held ancestral wounds and things like that around those of us who, we have the awareness that the druids and the witches and the shamans and the indigenous people all over the planet, who are very in touch with what wildness means and very in touch with nature and very in touch with these aspects of self, are demonized and murdered and killed and needing to be saved by Jesus and transformed into better people because they're savage and there's a lot of negative connotation that we've all grown up with and have a certain social conditioning around what it means not to be civilized, right? Wild is actually not a very, it's not a very safe thing. There's danger there that we've been taught, even though it's probably a lot more dangerous to get in your car and drive through the city than it is to go out into the wild and be alone in nature. But I know for myself, I had to really do a lot of working through, like, okay, I'm safe, it's okay. All of these old stories and these old, visuals of what happens when you're alone in nature, especially as a woman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then some of that, the question becomes, well, how much of that is actual fear of nature, or is it fear of a person coming to hurt you while you're alone, right? Which is, again, a little bit different, where it's not actually the wild that is the root of that fear, but the conditioned illnesses of society. Right.
Yeah, but it's still the same context. So it can be one of those reasons why you're like, well, I would never do that. I would never go out into nature by myself because somebody could attack me or whatever that is. It's still that fear that's there that might be holding you back. So just to be paying attention to what that might mean.
Right. And in addition to any fears that we've learned or that we're conditioned into, I think it, definitely bears some merit on, well, once you actually get there and once you are participating in this more wild experience, what does that actually kind of clue you into in this more primal way? And I'll share with you what I mean. It's like this, we usually think we have an understanding of nature, or think that we have some understanding of the elements until we actually get in it in this really visceral, unavoidable way. And then it's almost this whole other realm of, holy fuck, the ocean doesn't care whether I live or die, right? Like the ocean as the wild expression of water and nature, like these waves are their own being in and of themselves that has absolutely nothing to do with me. And it's this very, very humbling, surrendering experience that can open up to this whole other, again, type of primal fear where it's beyond this whatever mental conditioning is happening. And that's where some of this that feral survival and work and being part of nature comes into play. Or being out in the desert, for example, and I have never been in the desert in a way where I did not have some sort of, water or resource or connection or know that I could go somewhere. But I remember this very visceral experience of being out in the desert, again, knowing that I was safe and that I could take myself somewhere if I needed to, and I was okay. But again, this same experience of the desert doesn't care about me. The desert has absolutely no investment in my health and well-being and happiness. And so the wildness there, observing this raw, very elemental experience of earth in a very uncomfortable way, being hot and sweaty and tired and thirsty, and knowing that I could remove myself and go into a restorative space, but allowing myself to just spend time in the discomfort of what the true wildness meant for me in terms of my own survival. And also in terms of the connection that took place as a result. It was this really kind of communion experience of, well, the desert doesn't care if I live or die. And if I didn't have measures to help myself and be safe, then I might very well die / would eventually die given enough time wandering out in the desert by myself. But what does having contact with that then help me access and surrender to within myself of what is it like to live in that elemental space, and what is it like to find that access point to that same elemental consciousness that lives within me as the desert and the waves and the mountains themselves. Where is that access point internally? And that's a whole other level of fear, completely beyond the conditioned mental level. It's this like terrifying access point to power and true wildness that we don't actually know what it feels like until you get there. And then there aren't words for it. It's, again, exists beyond the cognitive, beyond the linguistic, beyond the mental capacity. It's a felt sense.
Right. And it's there that you can learn things that you can't learn in any other way. And you have connections, and you have your own sense of self in a totally different context and awareness of who you are as a human, right? By being wild. So you can understand yourself in a different way.
Yeah. Well, how about we, let's offer people a couple of ways. We did already give you some ways that you can go practice rewilding, but I think number one is essentially like go spend time in nature. Really quite that simple. Get outside, ideally by yourself, and go spend some time being alone in nature and see what happens.
Yeah. And not like, oh, I have to go do all these things, or I'm going skiing, or not with a whole big agenda around it, but just, I'm actually just going to go, I'm going to find a spot, and I'm going to go on some walks or whatever, but I'm just going to be in this space and see what emerges.
Honestly, that's a great place to start, and that'll get you really far.
There's also a lot of primal movement styles of classes now and so on that use sort of animal style movements, and a lot of crawling and hands and feet and moving the body around and in different ways than we're used to, and using these different aspects of the body working in collaboration with the brain so that it shifts your consciousness quite a bit, actually, to move in a way that you've never moved before, that is mimicking ways that animals move. And it can be an amazing workout, because you start using muscles you don't usually move. And then also it definitely is a shift in consciousness, because your brain is working in a different way when you start to sort of feel yourself moving in this other way. And like, get outside and take your shoes off and feel your feet and feel what it really feels like to be embodied. And again, go back to the last episode and watch that one, and feel what it really feels like to be in your body and in collaboration and connection with the earth and with nature and with the elements as well. Like, what does that feel like if you're by a body of water? What does it feel like for you to fully feel as though that water has completely embodied you? And what would that feel like? And what would it look like? And what would it sound like? And what would it move like? And let yourself have that very real, physical, felt experience of having that happen for yourself. And do that with all of the elements and see how that changes your experience of it.
Yeah. And so many more. There's so many things that you can do with this and play with this and practice with this. Please keep in mind, though, invitation not only to have the experience of what is it like to access this wild nature, but then how does that translate into the rest of your life? So as with everything, integration is what helps you take action and helps you implement the whatever work it is that you're doing. So I do invite you, as you are exploring these practices, then notice, well, how am I, taking more care with the way that I'm moving in my life, or how am I relating in these to these elemental forces in the rest of my life, or how am I, what does my wild animal self want to have for breakfast, or whatever it is that you want to play with, but letting yourself have that continued practice and integration and access point within the rest of your day-to-day experience. Yeah. Beautiful. Well, we left you with a lot there, so enjoy. And please know that, again, Kat and I both do spend a lot of time with this, and this is a big thing for both of us that we don't necessarily talk about so much. I'm starting to kind of put some stuff out in the world because I've had enough people ask me, and it's come up enough times, and it's like, all right, I'm listening. I'm starting to make this more of an official thing that you can join me with. On that note, as we are closing, Kat and I are going to share with you just some ways that you can continue to stay in touch and work with us. Before we get there, though, please note, we do produce this podcast for you as our gift to you, because that's something that's really important to us. And it does cost us to produce the podcast. So we pay for some production fees, we pay for uploading, we pay for, various behind the scenes costs of producing the podcast. And of course, this is, we're gifting you our time. So we do want to keep producing it. We've got almost 100 episodes now. Thank you for spending the last, however long you've been engaged with us. And we've been doing this for a few years. So thank you for continuing to stay in touch with us and let us know how this is supporting you. If our work has supported you, we would really love it if you feel called to donate for the podcast, for production costs, for our time, everything. There are a couple ways you can do that. You can send us money via PayPal to Shaman Sister Sessions at gmail.com through PayPal. Again, Shaman Sister Sessions at gmail.com, or you can find us on Patreon. That's patreon.com. Find Shaman Sister Sessions on there and become a patron of our work. Even if you choose to donate $1 or $1 per month, that would be helpful in terms of helping us sustain this podcast and keep it afloat. So if you feel called, we would deeply appreciate it. If you've gotten anything out of these episodes, please consider donating. On that note, Kat, what do you have going on that people can work with you and relate with you?
Well, I think by the time that this will be aired, I will have just started Open Your Channel. So that will probably already, February 9th is the beginning of Open Your Channel. So it might still be possible to join if you feel highly ambitious to join the lead container of Open Your Channel and work with me in an online course which has recorded and live teachings, meditations, practices, connecting to your higher self, understanding channeling, and different ways of receiving communication, and how to live an embodied, healthy channel. And then other than that, then we're going to have a retreat in association with that course at the beginning of April in New Mexico, and Michelle's going to come and help facilitate that. That's going to be super fun as we practice 9 forms of mediumship and channeling. And other than that, if you're interested in working with me privately, I do probably have some space for a couple of mentorship clients or healing work clients. And more to come.
Great. Beautiful. And if you're in the Portland area, or if you're not in the Portland area and you're interested in doing some work with me, that is an option. For those of you in the Portland area, I am in direct relation to what we talked about in the last couple of episodes. I'm starting to get the Embody Wild movement going. So right now that's happening in a series of local events. If you're interested, you can reach out to me. You can find me through joyofenergy.com and get on my list for invitations to upcoming events if you want to work in getting out of your head and into your body and accessing your original wild nature. So again, joyofenergy.com. If you're not on my list already, I invite you to do so that you can be first to know about upcoming invitations and ways to come play. And for now, thank you. That's all we got for you today. There's plenty for you to play with and practice. And if you want to let us know how it goes, you can always send us an email, shamansistersessions@gmail.com. And again, thank you for continuing to follow us and to support our work. We really appreciate it.